Now, Prof, the points about moving from taxation to production, which was a major theme in your manifesto, he questions that. He says that you've done the opposite of that, regardless of the nuisance taxes that you removed, about 15 of them or so in the first budget. He also raises questions about you promising, mindful of the fact that you knew the economy was in a state that could not support these promises right from day one, which is what you're facing as reality today. Was there deception in these promises?
There was no deception in these promises. I mean, you know, when you set up a target, a low target, you know, it doesn't energize you in trying to achieve the target. You have to set a target which is challenging.
But were these realistic targets?
They were realistic and challenging. Yes, they were. So of course, I'm not sure which ones that he is referring to, but the point that we have every district will have a factory, I don't think it is something that cannot be achieved.
There's free SHS.
The fact that you want to reduce taxes, I don't think it's something that we cannot achieve.
So, look, Prof, let me give me a second. You talked about whether or not we can achieve these one district, one factories. As of today, how many of the factories are running 2 years into the promise?
You see, that is the misunderstanding that a lot of people have. You see, a factory, if even you have all the facilities right now and you are asked to put up a factory, it doesn't take a year. It takes more than a year to do it. So people are just asking questions as if you can go to the shop and then pick a factory and then run with it. That is not how it works. First of all...
But forgive me, because the government promised in the first year that it would actually put in place 51 of these factories. This was first budget promise. I mean, to all intents and purposes, government should have known that it wouldn't take a year to do so.
That's what I'm saying. When the government said that it's going to start 51, it was not said that, you know, at the end of the year, you can go in there and then the factories will be producing this thing.
I see.
And that is why I'm talking about, when I began my career, I worked at the Ministry of Industries.
Okay.
That's where I worked. And I know how, I mean, the gestation period for actually setting up a factory. It doesn't go there overnight. You start with maybe even identifying where to put the factory. You know this is the area that you're going to put it. You need to have access road to that place. You need to have electricity to that place. You need to build the factory. You need to bring in import equipment. And at times, even you have to import raw materials. So these are not something that you can go overnight and switch on and they say, tomorrow we have a factory. No. That is why people are worried about it. But the point is that most of these things, you see, when you set up something that you want to do and you're determined to do it, you know, nothing changes, nothing stops you. It goes on and on and on and on. And I'm sure that, you know, within the next 4 years, you see some of these things, or some of these, the next 2 years, you see some of these factories operating. But to have said that, you know, I mean, because you promised that you have one district, the factory in every district, we expect you to have a factory running within 1.5 years. It doesn't happen that way.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So I think, and you see on this...
No, he did hint that the other promise, which he thinks were not based on the reality on the ground, is specifically free SHS.
Oh, that's what he said? Why is it not realistic? You know, you see, look, in this country, the only thing that you can bequeath to the children of this country that really can stand the test of time is to give them a quality human capital. That is the only thing that you have. Look, when you look at children on the roadside, and people are saying that maybe we should have waited until maybe 2019 or 2020 to start this thing. You know how many people will have lost about, if we had waited 90,000 times about 270,000 children, leaving them on the roadside. For me, if we are able to get these 270,000 children into secondary schools rather than leaving them on the street, I prefer that to even building a road from here to my hometown.
I see, but you stress on quality human resource. Currently in this state, how does it guarantee you quality?
You see, people argue about quality of human resources, and they are talking about individuals. You put the whole Ghanaian, the children, 500,000 of them, who can have access to secondary school, compared with only 250 who will have had access to secondary school, but for the free SHS. Put them together in qualitative terms. Put them together. These 500 people that you have now, and then the 250 who will have been somewhere wayward, plus the 250 who will have had access to school. Put them together as a group. Which one gives you equality? The 500 that they are all in school, and then the 250, some of them in school, and the 250 who are just outside there. You see, so it has to be looked, the quality even should be looked at holistically rather than individuals.
Even out of the 500,000, the likelihood that 70% of this will not go further beyond to the tertiary institutions is very clear. Look at the data over the period. So that equally tells you about the quality of the education at that level. I hope that's clear to you.
Yes, it tells you, but you see, the human capital of 500,000 will be better when you put them together than just 250 who are good and then 250 who are just wayward.
I get your point. Now,
if I may just clarify this point.
Please do.
Just a quick one. One challenge. If you were to complete the schools, we are not speaking as if there were no alternatives. If you were to complete the schools, which is the alternative, you will be placing these children in schools close to their homes.
The 200 that was,
close to their homes. Secondly, yes, it's a laudable. And for me, as somebody who went to school on a government scholarship, I'm not going to sit here and debase the value of, education to any child. But the point is, do you have to be targeted in doing this? Every nation requires of the people it has educated, like myself, to make a contribution. So if I believe the majority of people sitting here are capable of taking their children to school, why aren't you being targeted? More targeted. Why do you take on the entire? This is the fiscal sustainability. These are the causes of the fiscal sustainability that we are talking about. And it tells you that it was a policy that was made without regard to the economy. What is the consequence? The consequence is that we are capping, from district assemblies common fund, from national health insurance, from any revenue source. Almost all revenue sources are being capped to sustain the same, promises. The consequence of which is development is lagging in the districts where the district assemblies common fund should have been used. Development is lagging. If, with hindsight, now we are going to be borrowing based on GET fund to do infrastructure, to accommodate, the additional students. Is that not the free schools policy? No, that should have been. So I'm saying that.
And I want to be clear in my mind. So when the NDC did free day school, was it a targeted program?
It was going to be targeted.
Was going to be. But it was implemented in this first year. Was it targeted?
No, remember we started with schools under trees.
Yes.
For elementary schools. And I don't think that anybody will tell me that schools under trees, for the villages that either did not have the schools, or for the villages and other places, not just villages, frankly, even in the cities and others, for whom you had to, they had to go to school, not under trees, and where the name came from. You wouldn't tell me that it has improved the quality of education in the country. And I'm saying that the schools actually started.
Okay.
Some were being utilized. So the point I'm making is that if you were to complete the schools, you would put more. And in advanced countries, for those of us who have lived there, even in the US, most secondary schools are day schools. Most are day schools. Yes.
I need to move on to this other issue because you also raised it. You talked about taxes, and Prof, crux of his engagement is that, contrary to your claim, you are still increasing taxes. That's without doubt in his mind that that is happening. So you've gone back on your promise not to move from taxation to production in this case. And he's saying that you are not even taxing the right sectors in the first place. Removing taxes on the services sector was a very bad decision. He believes so. I want to find out from you whether the claims about taxation not really going to happen under the NPP is going to be maintained going forward, or government is consistently reviewing that policy.
You see, look, the essence of moving away from taxation to production is really to say that, you know, you are going to give some incentive to the private sector to be able to produce more.
But I didn't say you're not going to introduce taxes again.
No, nobody said that he was not going to introduce taxes again. What they are saying is that we are moving away from taxation to production. And you can imagine that taxes, not even taxes, tariffs, which are taxes anyway, on electricity were removed. So you are trying to take those taxes away.
Some of it, actually, yeah.
So that they can actually produce. All these nuisance taxes that we are referring to, a lot of them were on the private sector, and they were not very, very big taxes in terms of government, but that's why we call them nuisance. I mean, it's bothersome. The transaction cost of doing them, I mean, small taxes and bothering you. The transaction costs were just too high for the business people. That is why we moved them. So these are aimed at, you know, shifting away from those taxes that are just nuisance to the people and taxes that are actually putting the cost of doing business so high away from them so that they can produce. That is the essence of that.
Okay. Now, let me get this.
The real taxes that are a nuisance, and pardon me, are the denial of input tax credits under the VAT 3% regime, and now the removal of the National Health Insurance and GET Fund from the VAT base, which is denying businesses, you know, input tax credit. And it's a backdoor way of increasing the VAT, because if you deny them the input tax credit, which is the strength of the VAT, they would add it to prices. And that is the result we are seeing. So the government is not getting the revenue. Businesses are increasing, you know, because of increased costs, are increasing prices, and these are being passed on, you know, to consumers. So you have a policy that is, you know, unfriendly to business, unfriendly, you know, to consumers, and indeed harmful to the government itself, because it's not generating the revenue. Okay. You are seeing tax evasion and avoidance. That is the nuisance tax is the personal income tax increase from 25% to 35% and now 30%.
You made that point, Mr. Tekpe. I need to move on. And Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo has been following this conversation. Doc, I mean, these are politicians in all of his forms.
Excuse me, I'm a tax practitioner.
He's an expert in taxes. So.
Okay, I get your point, but let me come to you, Doc. From what you say, are we heading the right direction? And this is specifically when it comes to whether or not we've moved from taxation to production, whether or not we've genuinely grown the economy in a way that will provide the jobs for the people, or we are still in the jobless growth phenomenon. And again, whether the business-friendly policies that government promised has really been put together. Is that what you get when you test the pulse of the economy?
Yes, thank you very much once again, Raymond, and good morning to your listeners and viewers as well. Overall, I would want to, like you said, as an independent observer in this game that we are playing, I would want to throw a little bit light on where we were and where we are now, right? We all know that currently we are operating under the extended credit facility under the World Bank, which we subscribed to in 2015. At the time we went under the program, we were struggling because we needed to stabilize the macroeconomic environment. We needed credibility for policy and support essentially the significant depreciation of the cedi at the time. So when you look at the GDP trajectory at the time, in 2014, we grew at 4%. 15, we grew at 3.8, and then in 2016, we grew at 3.7. And coming to the NPP era, which is 2017 onwards, in 2017, we grew at 8.4, and then the projected growth for the end of year for this year is 6.3. So looking at just these numbers, I would say that we are on the right course, really. But the question you ask is this an inclusive growth, or is this growth that is driven mainly by the extractive sector? When you look at the non-oil growth in terms of GDP, it's also not doing quite badly. And then when you look at that, you see that the deviation is not that significant before the NPP era and the NPP era at this point. In 2016, non-oil grew at 5.0. 2017, it was 4.0. And now it is projected to be 5.0. So the real issue is the structural challenges that Prof was talking about have not been tackled. And we all agree that these structural challenges cannot be tackled overnight.
Sorry, let me be clear. When you say structural challenges, exactly what are we talking about? So everybody get to understand and know where we are. What are they?
Okay, so the nature of our economy, really. Which sectors are driving our growth? How are our production organized, for example? So when you look at this, the structure of our economy, we are gradually moving from an agrarian economy where, our production was basically from the agricultural sector. We are trying to, when you look at the numbers, you see that the dominance of the agricultural sector is being eroded over time, right? Okay. And then the expectation is that when every country is growing, agriculture will lose its dominance and then move into industry and then later into services. When you look at our numbers currently, we see that agriculture has lost its dominance, but we are moving into services rather than the industrial sector. Okay. And the industrial sector is the critical middle belt which we need for employment generation. Okay. Right. So by that, you mean that we are not growing the economy in a way that will give us jobs? When you look at the numbers, if growth is driven mainly by the extractive sector, then this growth is not inclusive in terms of job creation. Right? Do you get a sense that we are heading there? Government says one district, one factory is the way forward. Government says improving the human resource of the people is also the way forward, and that giving incentives to current businesses to operate and get better is also the way forward. Do you see that happening in reality? Yes, I see attempts on the part of government to try and expand the economy by, for example, the removal of some taxes, in the past, and also, the introduction of some creative ideas so that the private sector would have the chance to flow. When I look at some of the numbers, for example, a critical stats that I'm interested in, for instance, is the government borrowing, treasury bill rate, for instance, right? We know that when government borrows from the private sector, the rate it pays to the private sector, if this rate is quite high, then it means that government is competing with the private sector, right? That it makes it difficult for the ordinary person to get this same loan. Exactly, because government is a very credible borrower, right? So if I come to you asking for a loan and government is also asking for a loan, obviously, governments, I know if I give my money to the government, I would have it any day, any time that I want, right? So government is a credible borrower. By the share size of it, for example. So when you look at the T-bill rate, we see that it has consistently declined. In 2014, we had 25.8 treasury bill, 91-day end of year treasury bill rate. In 2015, it was 23.1. In 2016, it came to 16.8. And in 2017, it was 13.3. And currently, as at last month, it was 13.4, right? So this one too, when you look at the trajectory, you see that this was on a path to decline.
Okay.
Right. Before, before the government took over, it was on a path to decline, and it has declined sharply, right, since they came, into power in terms of what we are trying to do. The prime rates has also, observed a steady path. Where we talk about the prime rate, we are looking at the lending rates by the central bank to the commercial banks, right? And then when we fix that rate, we know that nobody can borrow money anywhere below that rate. And that also, as at yesterday, was maintained at 17%. Issues have been raised as to how the prime rate translates into the lending rate. Because when you look at the average bank lending rates, that is also quite high. And the spread between the prime rate and the lending rate, we've always raised issues with it. As of 2016, the lending rate was 31.7%. Right, meaning that an average Ghanaian walking to the bank had to borrow and pay 1/3 in interest, really, to the bank. But in 2017, it came to 29.3, and as at October this year, it was 26.9. These rates are quite high, but we see that is on. They are declining, but the rate of decline is quite marginal. So these are areas that government would have to look into in terms of, and all these have ramifications in terms of how government plays a critical role in the financial sector. For example, government borrowing from the domestic economy. All these have important implications in terms of access to finance by the ordinary Ghanaian.
We're still live on Joy 99.7, also on your JoyNews channel, Multi TV. I told you I'm doing this with Philip. And Philip, interesting conversation so far.
Very interesting. Raymond, I want to start off with this, if Professor Jambafa can help us. With regards to the removal of taxes, we saw the same thing in the United States, where President Trump removed some taxes. There was some analysis by Bloomberg where we saw that most of these tax cuts, when the companies received these benefits from the tax cuts, most of it went to share buybacks, and little went into expanding R&D or expanding services or expanding their businesses. With regards to the removal of these nuisance taxes, as was put by Professor Jamboa from 2017, can he give us a picture of how businesses in Ghana have brought in new employees? Because we had, again, from 2017 right down to now, the banking sector challenges, where, again, we had jobs being lost. So you have a case where businesses are expected to expand with regards to removal of taxes, but at the same time, businesses, again, are being crippled by the same nerve of the financial system or the economy, where we have the banks going under. And we saw the interconnected nature of the banks to other parts of the economy. So, Professor, if you can give us some light on how we can marry these two.
Yeah, I think maybe we need to separate the two. These banks going under is another subject altogether, because I think some of them are just were not operating within the confines, the boundaries of banking practices.
I'm referring to the loss of jobs from the banking sector.
From the banking sector.
Yes.
It's because some of them will have to fold, and once they fold, yes, there will be losses. But let me say that when you look at the growth in these areas, especially in industry, where the taxes that we are referring to were actually taken away from, you see that the growth in the industrial sector has gone up so much. In 2016, it was 4.3, or in 2015, 1.1. 2016, 4.3. 2017, it jumps to 15.7. The growth rate in the industrial sector, and a large proportion of it, a lot of it was oil, but a large proportion of it also was in the manufacturing. I don't have figures as to how many jobs were created in the manufacturing sector, but if you correlate the growth rate in those sectors with employment, there must have been either there has been additional employment or it has actually reduced the rate at which they were reducing jobs in those areas. I don't have the figures to give you very specifically that this is how much it's, but yes, there is an indication there that there was actually some job growth, and in fact, people are using figures from Senate data and all that to justify that. Yeah. But that one, I am a bit, I'm very cautious about using that thing, you see, because if in the past SNIT was not doing the right thing and they are doing the right thing now, it may give you an illusion that it is actually a job growth. But certainly, yes, there has to be a correlation between the growth of the services, the industry sector and growth rates. But, coming back to the banking thing, as for the banks, there are some of them that were not doing very well. A lot of it has to do with what the professor was actually talking about. That the lending rates were just too much, and then they had a lot of loans that were not doing very well. So in their books, there were a lot of bad loans in their books, and they were not checking them properly, and the Bank of Ghana actually was not doing a right oversight over some of them. So some of them were investing in areas where normal banks will not do, and so that is where the problems actually came from maybe the governance structure of these banks. Some of them were not really handling the places very well. You can go into the books and see those ones who were lending to friends and sisters and brothers and things like that, where they were not paying. So these ones probably should not be something that should be seen as maybe an action of government or anybody, but the governance of these institutions. So in general, I think, yes, some of these taxes that were removed and some of the things that came from the energy sector and all those things, certainly there was some indication in terms of employment growth. Okay.
Mr. Tabe, you want to respond to something?
Yeah, if I may. I think that the growth we are seeing in the manufacturing and industrial sector generally has to do with the resolution, partly or substantially to do with the resolution of the power crisis. Because when we didn't, during the period of doomsday when power was not available to industry, you saw industry actually even shedding, jobs and employment. And therefore you will see the figures that was read, that's from around about 2014. It took 2.5 years from 2012 to resolve that problem. And therefore you began to see, some, I doubt very much if it's on account of, any tax decreases. Probably for the real estate and for the non-core financial services sector, which the VAT, was removed. Admittedly, it would have some impact there, but that's for the consumer. VAT is a consumer tax, anyway. Now, the other point is we should not forget smart borrowing. In 2014, going into 2015, that's when we took, Prof was in Parliament, 1 billion, bond. The entire bond that was issued that year was used to refinance short-term debts. In other words, instead of rolling over those treasury bills that government had issued and others, what we did was to package them, use the 1 billion, which is for 15 years, to pay them off instead of the rollover that were, and avoid the rollover risk, and then put in place a sinking fund from the oil revenues. Today, we are not contributing to the sinking fund. The sinking fund contributed $500 million of our own oil revenues to take off the 2007 bond. The balance was taken October 4th, 2017, quietly, even though we won a prize, and all that, the sinking fund that we put in place through the buyback. So Ghanaians use their own oil revenue of $500 million to take off $750 million. The $250 million that was left was partly refinanced, with the World Bank bond. Once you did that, it means that government was not in the market to refinance. And you saw the TB rate, begin to go down, together with, with other rates. So there are policy choices that underlie, some of these things. The sustainability is the issue. The same thing happened to debt. Once we started paying down the debt through the sinking fund, the buybacks, you began to see, actually, you look at the rate of increase in debt. If we can move away from nominal and look at the rate of increase in debt, there was actually a decline. In 2017, there's a tick, where the rate of increase in the debt is going up. Again, if we had a graph, we would have shown it. In the budget, it is there. You see, a slight tick up, which is attributable to the loans that have been taken to resolve the banking, sector crisis. Is there. Now, that brings a very important cost, that when you don't resolve, and the advanced countries found this to their, remember quantitative easing and others, when those banks began to go down, we needed to learn a lesson from that. Because when the first bank was let go, in the US, they had to put in banking resolution, alternative banking resolution strategies, same as Royal Bank of Scotland and the rest, even in the advanced countries, alternatives to, and that's how come we did ESLA, to resolve that problem. Otherwise, yes, you may have shareholders and others, but ultimately it is depositors and it is employees who will take the brunt. And that's the essence of ESLA. Today, the ESLA bond is 10 years, 7 to 10 years, which means that ESLA, by implication, and that's a tax increase, we were going to do it at 3 to 5 years. The first restructuring that we did, the VRA debt, 2.2 billion, was to be paid in 3 to 5 years. That has been refinanced and incorporated in the 7 to 10-year bond. The implication is that the bond is going to be with us for 10 years, unless you get an alternative for the markets. Now, ESLA is bringing in about 1.2 billion for the energy, another 1.3 or so, for the enhanced road levy. And then there are other ones, which on average is about 3 billion. If you are going to extend, and this is a question, if you are going to extend a debt which is bringing in, yes, it's a levy, which is bringing in approximately 3 billion Ghana cedis annually. For 10 years, that is 30 billion Ghana cedis. How come we are not using 30 billion Ghana cedis to resolve the banking crisis, which is, we are told in the budget is 11 to 15 billion. How come we have to borrow again, to resolve those banking crises when you have ESLA as an imposition? Where is the ESLA funds going? Okay. That is a question. This is the fiscal sustainability, of promises which I'm talking about. Is the ESLA, we are waiting for the ESLA report, to be published. And so I think that just to learn some clarification to some of the factors, which have been raised.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we will go to Dr. Chumesi Bafo coming pretty soon on this one. But just so you know, if you're still waiting to join us here at the Alisa Hotel, you're welcome, because we're still in the conversation. Of course, it's the Labadi Beach Hotel, and we surely will be welcoming you very wonderfully to this place to join us. We are here from now to 8 p.m., so you don't forget. We will switch over at 10 o'clock, talk about education. Education is followed by health, and all the other important sectors of the nation's economy will be happening live. I have already seen a deputy education minister seated at the back there. Dr. Osei Oduchim is already there. That means that conversation will be coming up later on. We're still having our conversation here, but those of you are already with us here, and if you are home too, you can tweet us as hashtag is actually NPP scorecard. So we can tweet at us with that particular hashtag, NPP scorecard, and you'll be part of this particular conversation on social media and the other outlets available in this space too. Now, pretty soon, I see Dr. Ebo texting in the audience. I see other people too. I'll be bringing you in to ask your questions. Indeed, the scorecard is really for you to assess what's been happening in the last 2 years. We will bring you in to interrogate to get further ideas on how your marking and your scoring is going to go. So we'll be coming to that. But Philip, you had other questions, starting with Dr. Bafo.
Okay, yeah. Doc, Mr. Tekpe took us to debt. I want you to help us with some understanding. In the budget, we saw that the banking sector problems had increased our debt to GDP ratio to about 70.7%. But we've seen the rebasing of the economy in September 2018, where the economy has expanded by 24.5%. We've seen that this debt to GDP ratio has come down. I was looking at the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, the DSA, and it says we are still at a high risk of debt distress. With regards to debt management, what do you think the performance has been, broadly speaking?
Okay, so in terms of debt sustainability, we know that the IMF standard for a debt sustainability level is nothing above 70% of your GDP. And when you look at the numbers, it sees that we are still, hovering around dangerous zones. The rebasing has brought it down to, I think the projected is now 70.3%. In the old, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So it tells us that as a country, we need to, take a second look at basically how we are borrowing and how we are servicing our debt as well. And one key thing that we also need to look at is the important role that the exchange rate also plays in this debt management, in that in recent times, like the former minister indicated, smart borrowing means that we left the domestic market and went into the international market to borrow, which was, a great initiative, but it also comes at a risk. And the risk is that you are borrowing in foreign currency and you pay back in foreign currency as well. So whenever there was significant depreciation of the currency, it had an effect on there. So that is something that I would not say, we are in a comfortable position. The managers of the economy still have to keep their eyes on the debt position of the country.
Is the germane question not what we borrow to do?
Exactly.
In this case.
Exactly.
Are we borrowing for productivity or we are borrowing for consumption? What are we doing now?
Okay, so like you rightly said, if we are borrowing to expand the base of the economy, then we should not be distressed about our capability to pay back. It means that we would be able to pay back. But the question is, the funds that we have borrowed, what have we used them for? Right. What have we used them for? And I don't
you're an
have
economist.
the numbers.
You should be in a position to tell me.
Exactly. But I did not want to bore your audience with too many numbers. But what I'm saying is that the funds that we have borrowed, what have we used them for? And what are our plans for future borrowing as well? Right.
Do you get a sense that we are doing more consumption borrowing or we are doing productivity borrowing?
I would say that we are basically maintaining the status quo.
Which is exactly what?
Which is exactly what, in the sense that when we take, when you look at government revenue and expenditure, we see that compensation and statutory payments basically erodes everything.
So we are borrowing for consumption?
I
need you to answer this question for me before we move on. Are we borrowing for consumption or borrowing for productivity?
I think that argument, that is what it's in the public domain. But let me try and explain something.
No, which one specifically?
That people like saying it's for consumption. So
what do you think is the reality?
That is what I'm going to tell you, that it is not for consumption.
I see.
You see, when in the energy sector we are having difficulty with, of course, the minister mentioned Dumso and that right, and then you borrow money to go and make sure that Dumso stops. You see, it is not that you are going to borrow that money to build another infrastructure, another generating capacity. But you are borrowing money so that the generating capacity that you have can work. So in effect, the borrowing is not for consumption, but it's actually to enable investment to operate. So that is one area. Two, and I'm going to share with you the figures of things that were borrowed this year, and then you see whether these are for consumption or for investment. You know, when you look at the budget statement, you know, when you go back to maybe those of you who have it, you have budget statement page 238 that talks about list of loans signed in 2018. And then when you look at them closely, what you see is that they are not for consumption. And maybe I'll take off my glasses and read them to you.
Now, okay, so you made a point. Because of my time, I just want to do a few of them. Yes.
You see, one, it says project financing, Upper East Water Supply Projects. That's not for consumption. Savannah Zone Agricultural Productivity Improvement Project, not for consumption. Construction of 7 bridges in northern Ghana. Rural Enterprise Project, Nationwide Water Networks, implementation of photovoltaic based street lighting, upgrading and enhancement of technical vocational training colleges, improving access to quality health care in the Western region, establishment of deposit protection schemes. It goes on and on and on.
Okay.
None of it here is for consumption.
I get your
but
point.
the point is that, it is very easy for people to get away with saying that, oh, it is for consumption, so it's for consumption. Because I think it came from some IMF report some time back that instead of using it for production, you are using it for consumption. And that has become a cliche that everybody uses without really going down there to look at what really the borrowed monies are for.
And do you agree, Mr. Tekpe?
The borrowed monies are for.
Is the NPP borrowing for consumption or production?
Well, of course, I think the PFMA, the Public Financial Management Act, which we did, requires more accountability, and one result is the publication of the use of funds. I would like to see the use of funds for 2017, not just for 2018, when those funds were taken to make a conclusion. The debt management report will come out, and I believe we can have a conversation on it. But an aspect let me draw attention to one aspect. If you borrow for a primary school or for a water system, particularly boreholes and the rest, obviously you are not going to ask school kids, to be paying for, the classroom and the rest. But part of the problem we have had, which is part of our smart borrowing policy, is that if you borrow to do Terminal 3 and you collect airport tax, you don't allow airport company to use that money exclusively for their salaries and for their operations. And this is where the self-financing. We had lost that. In fact, Akosombo Dam paid for itself. That's the fact. And therefore, we went back. So from the Terminal expansion, port expansion project, Takoradi port expansion, to Terminal 3 itself, which is payable from airport tax. And by the way, from the Ghana Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is to invest in commercial projects. We say that those projects should pay. It shouldn't be the taxpayer. Those are some of the ways of relieving. Okay. Now, let me make a quick point. We should actually be, our debt to GDP ratio actually should be between 55 to 60, maximum 65.
Because of rebasing?
No, as a B-rated, as a B-rated country, if you want to move further, and be on the stock markets, then that is where you ought to be. So looking at 70 debt sustainability, and as we become middle income, I think we ought to be pitching for the markets and be taking our eyes off, those, rates that used to apply to developing countries that were taking concessional financing, which we are not going to. Let me make one quick point. On energy, we ought to have been in a situation where we would have been going structural by now. Why? Because, one, recall gas to power. If we had brought all of Sankofa, gas on stream, stabilize the power situation, industry will rebound, as we are saying, and we are likely to attract, more industries because of the stability of the power. That is how you move towards structural resolution and improvements, sustainable job improvements. Another one, if we use, as we were saying, moving to midstream, downstream, where we should be now, where the focus will be on petrochemical, where we use our salts in combination with our petroleum, byproducts to produce fertilizer and focus on the water basin, link agro-processing to Exim Bank so that you look outward. That's the essence of the Exim Bank, that was to provide, export credit and guarantee. It is not to provide largesse, for businessmen. No, they can borrow. I think these are some of the policies, which, we ought to be focusing on in the energy sector so that we add value, because Prof is right. Much of the export, besides our present share is 13 to 15%, and it's not much. The rest goes to the partners. Sometimes they spend, but we ought to be adding value in agri, adding value, and therefore the policy of bringing the gas on stream. And that's why issues like the PSP, issues, like the waterfall, the partial risk guarantee, pardon my technical, which we go from the World Bank, ought to be taken seriously. And that's the only way in which we would be, moving towards a structural, economy and generating and maintaining sustainable jobs.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you get a chance to comment on these comments from the people up here. What we've done in the last almost 1 hour is to be able to put into perspective what the real state of the economy today is. You have your own views on all of these, but first, I'm sure you want to interrogate further. So if you can put up your hand if you want to share some thoughts on what's been said so far, I want to start with you. I see Dr. Ebo Texan. I want to hear what you want to say about this. And of course, I'll start from the back door, but let me start with Dr. Ebo Texan. I want to know, we've also been joined by Professor Peter Korte too. So Dr. Ebo Texan first, comments or specifically questions on how far we've come 2 years into the NPP's administration, the economy in perspective.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. Yes, my colleague and the former minister and current minister have spoken. They've juggled the figures to us. So for 22 months, yes, the NPP has done well when it comes to the economy, maintaining the macro stability. Some of it might have started from the NDC time because you're under the ECF, and so we are becoming disciplined. So. But for the 22 months as we speak, interest rates have declined. Inflation has dropped into the zone that we are expecting. The deficit has also declined. But I had a comment for the reason why we still think that there's some borrowing that is done for consumption.
Okay.
If your capital expenditure, for instance, is 3% of your GDP, and your deficit is above 3%, it means that you are borrowing to fund some consumption. Because if the deficit is 9% and your capital expenditure is 3%, where is that 5% going? That 5% is going to consumption. So far as our capital expenditure is not higher than our deficit, then we are still borrowing to consume. Okay. And that is something that we need to quickly shed. I also listening to the target of the NPP for growth. I'll say that is not possible. We are not going to be able to achieve double digits. No, it's not going to be possible.
Not in 4 years.
No, we cannot do that. Even the East Asians that grew at extremely high rates, and we call it a miracle in development economics, they didn't go above those 15% that we are talking about. East Asia grew around 9 to 10%, 7 to 9 and 10%. Okay. And that is something that we cannot do. We should normally target have targets that are achievable. I don't foresee Ghana growing above 10%. Between 8 and 10%, that should be fine. Okay. And we should try as much as possible to sustain that growth over a long period of time, like Prof. Jambafo said, for it to trickle down to the pockets of the average Ghanaian. Then also...
I want to keep it short for me because I want to hear other people too.
Sure.
I want to hear the scoring from many.
My final comment was on the need to get this free SHS thing working. I know the education discussion is coming on. I heard the former minister talk about the e-schools. As much as the e-schools is a good way to add infrastructure to get people to get to schools, I think some of them were poorly cited. The target was wrong. So you had regions where there are big schools there and the population alone is so small that some of the classrooms will be empty. Okay. So I think that if they had gotten it right and they were properly cited, I'm certain that this government will be making use of those schools. And so that double track system would have happened, but not at this level that we find.
And certainly that conversation will happen in a couple of minutes from now. We'll be going back to it. But I need to hear other people. Forgive me, Dr. Texan. I wish you stay with us for a while longer because some of these issues will definitely be dealt into. Yes, but main questions. Daniel is at the back there. I don't know if Daniel has a question. Yes.
First of all, thank you. Thanks. First of all, thank you, Dr. Texan. You raised an initial point I wanted to raise about the
CAPEX GDP ratio and what it says about our spending. I have a question for Mr. Tekpe and Prof. Jambafo. Mr. Tekpe, you were finance minister. PwC in their 2018 budget highlight stated that because we often overproject how much revenue we are going to make, and we have been underperforming when it comes to revenue targets for about 10 years, we are often too ambitious when we are projecting our expenditure. And so we find that there are lots of ambitious promises, lots of ambitious plans in the budget, but the truth is we don't have the money to spend. Can I have a comment on that from Prof. Janbafo? And
thank you so much, Daniel. I'll come here, but I need the very last person, if you're out there, to share some thoughts before I move in here. Whilst we wait for you to make up your mind on that, let me come to this question. It's actually concluding remarks from you on this particular one, because we've already run, virtually are going to take the time of the next conversation to, Prof, you seem like you want to say something more, but please, to this question that the gentleman just asked, if you could just react to it, Daniel's own. Specifically, he talked about the capital expenditure as a percentage of the GDP, and it being a sign that we are really not only, as was suggested by Dr. Taxation, not doing borrowing for production alone.
Well, I don't quite agree. But it indeed, yes, it shows that maybe you are using part of it for some consumption, yes. But I don't think it's totally true. Certainly, because you see, the deficit is really both. Part of it is actually going for financing some of these capital expenditures, and some of it's financing consumption. So it's not fully like that. But then, yes, I agree that something like that can happen. But on the issue of
projections, whether they are reasonable,
I share that same view with you as well. But you see, I think we have to be careful not to over anticipate some of these things, and usually that is what happens. And when I know very well that a lot of ministers of finance, when they come to the media, we see that they do some reviews and try to bring it down because they maybe overshot.
Okay.
A lot of it actually comes from, in fact, where you want to sell state assets, and then you anticipate that you sell the assets, and then the assets, they don't materialize. And that is where the problem usually comes from with this overestimation. And I agree with you that I think we have to be careful with how much we project what we can actually collect.
Mr. Tekpe.
Well, just a quick one. I have often attended various fora, Professor Kwede, where some of that analysis, our budget is heavily earmarked. That's one point. Our budget is heavily earmarked. And what comes in as recurrent expenditure, for example, for GET Fund, for DACF, for NHI, some of it goes into capital. Because I have been at the UNESCO forum, for example, where analysis are being made, and you take the Ministry of Finance allocation for capital expenditure without GET Fund. So I know that, this is familiar and is very critical, but I only want to appeal to the academic community and others to take account of our earmarked funds and the monies that go into infrastructure. And I think the ministry could do well, particularly the boards, to differentiate their expenditures that go into recurrent and the expenditure, for example, GET Fund. All the GET Fund was part of the e-schools, was part of School Under Trees and whatever. All those are investments. But if you look at it as a transfer, which is how it is put in the budget, you would easily assume that it is going to consumption. On revenue, let me make 2 points. We discuss rebasing, for example, in the context of debt most of the time. Our revenue to GDP ratio has slumped as a result of rebasing. Mm-hmm. Now, if GRA is currently at, say, 12%, when as top of sub-Saharan Africa, let alone middle income, we should be 17.58%, and middle income above 20%. Then obviously you have to give GRA a challenge. But of course, we also know that increasing the tax to GDP ratio by even 1 percentage point, can take, is more difficult than expenditures, increasing expenditure. So it's a question of balance. How do you get GRA motivated? How do you, get them the resources and others, and giving them that challenge and making them push, harder to give the nation the resources that is required. But as a middle-income country that is losing grants and concessional financing may come with some slippages. So often the target setting is not deliberate, but things go wrong. For example, last point, 2015, 2017, as I was saying, when you do a budget with $99 per barrel, and then it slumps to $45 per barrel, you have to do a revision. If you don't, then you'll be overestimating significantly. That's a structural shock, which is not related to the ordinary. So these are some circumstances.
Okay, so I will get what they call it, Dr. Priscilla Balfour, to give me a comment on this, final comments, because this is how we concluded. But I will start the scoring from you. Score the government on the economy. I want you to, as usual, be your bold, daring self. And I'll be asking Prof and Mr. Tekpe to do the same before Mr. Tekpe and the rest of you will take leave of us pretty soon. Yes. So, Doc, if you can hear me, yes.
Okay, so Raymond.
Yes, I'm asking for final words, but I want you to also score the government 1 to 10. Where would you put this economy in the last 2 years? How has the nation performed?
Okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say a 7.
7?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
In terms of the key macroeconomic indicators that we see, growth, what do we call it? Interest rates, performance of the different sectors of the economy, and initiatives that have been taken that we know are taking off. But one thing I would also say is that in terms of the consolidation of the gains that we have made, we know that we are ending the program in December. This year. We would have to be more disciplined to consolidate the gains that have been made so that we don't run back to the IMF like every time, going back to daddy for to bail us out. Okay. Right. So in terms of the president's own, what do you call it? Ghana Beyond Aid, we should take our destinies into our own hands and manage our affairs well. There is the need for us to address the revenue shortfalls, just like the issue that Daniel raised, and for us to also address the fiscal slippages, right? So we are not overambitious in our revenue target, and based on that, go out spending.
I'll be glad if you join our later conversations, but thank you so much, Dr. Priscilla Balfour.
Thank you very
and also, thank you, but Prof.